You might be the only people access this. Cool. Thanks everyone for a good debate. We had a good discussion. I have two trainees, so I'm the only person that actually got voting privileges, but we did have a lot of agreements, but one core disagreement. But nevertheless, the call is as follows. We gave the first to opening government, the second to opening opposition, the third to closing opposition, the fourth to closing government. We thought the comparison that was the closest and most nuanced was that existed on top half, but we did have disagreements about initially about the positioning of closing government, which I will try to reflect as much as possible in the discussion. So I'm going to pursue this chronologically because I think it's the easiest way of not confusing people. So what happens on top half? So a lot of things are agreed on top half. So there is agreement that what happens to your community is something that the actor probably values most. This is both within opening opposition and in opening government. So we're going to use this. The metric is agreed that it's more what happens to your community than values to yourself, even though there's argumentation on top half about what actually affects each other, affects yourself as an actor, whether or not you have a legacy or pride or something that might change in the round. We see that the community stuff is clearer to explain on top of why people, like why both teams actually think this is valuable. This is largely because of opening opposition framing about what determines your value of an actor is based on the type of proximity and repetition of the narratives you experience. And indeed, a lot of the narratives that opening opposition, opening government talk about are very socially oriented narratives. So your position, your identity is shaped by what you're doing to your community and not doing to your community, which means we feel like this argumentation of what happens to your community is probably what the actor might care more about than individual based stuff, as in if you yourself feel good. So a lot of the argumentation both in opening government and opening opposition is how you feel as a product of not just what is happening to you, but largely what's happening to your family. As in even the arguments in opening government and opening opposition about pride. Pride is in itself a social emotion, as in a reflection of a social value placed upon yourself. And thus we think what happens to your community is how it best to arbitrate the persuasion of the top half. So what does opening government do to this, and what does opening opposition do to this, and why do we resolve to think the community is best held on opening government? Opening government starts off with a lot of narrative framing to describe why the power of the state is in such a way that it can fundamentally coerce individuals' conception of their identity. This is both within PM and DPM, where they describe that the way the minorities, even if they've experienced disposition and disprivilege, feel about your decision is based on what the government who I can't pronounce the name of, Malarian or whatever, not Malarian, Mali, views. And this is quite well done in DPM to argue why things like pride, information access, how your identity is shaped, the optionality and the shame-based narratives all make you and thus everyone around you feel as if what you're doing to the advantage of the Malian state matters. This is thus the first clash of internal conception, which is how does the minority community view you? Opening opposition's pushback is, I think, somewhat sufficient, but not completely sufficient. So opening opposition does a decent job of describing why you can have community-based narratives as well. This is, I think, sufficiently done in DLO, where they justify that, okay, maybe you have a lot of power as the Malarian state, or the Malarian state, since we're not, has a lot of power, but you can still have communal-based stories that are told throughout people's lives and communicated downwards, as in the more disparate the minority community, presumably the less effective control the state has. We think the state does have a lot of control at the end of top half. We don't think they have enough control to preclude opening opposition for accessing some types of minority oppression narratives. As in, some people we are convinced would dislike you for making this decision because they would feel as if you are partially a traitor because they haven't bought into the narratives. This then does two things, and I won't be very explicit. The first is we do think the margin of numbers of people who are doing what opening government believes is still high. We just don't believe it's total. This is the thing that opening opposition have convinced us that some people in your community will not like this decision because the social narratives have been outcompeted by more proximate narratives to you. So you tend to spend more time with people like your community than potentially the Valerian state. So even if opening government is correct that education and stuff like that propagandizes you, it's not enough to prevent opening opposition from having some of this. So why does opening opposition not still win this clash? The ultimate comparison of top half. So even if it's the case that there are some people in your community that don't like this decision, the question is now the tiered values that you have within that community. So opening opposition weighs this as proximity. So the way your proximate people around you feel about you is what's going to affect you most. Here, then, I think the contention from opening government that by becoming a warrior candidate, the state is self-interested in keeping your family close to you so that you don't have a psychological break and thus you're an effective soldier, as in the provision of resources, etc., is sufficient to justify why those that are most proximate to you would be able to either remain close to you or get a type of provision that they themselves would desire and would want. The question then becomes stickier, which is, does this family actually want to do this? Does the family actually acquiesce to moving in the first place? But these are two questions that opening opposition never levies to not be true, which would be more successful challenges against opening government. Here we think opening government's framing about the harm of disprivilege and why people just want to leave that type of area and want a better life is sufficient to justify why people, your immediate family, would take you up on the offer of moving to a higher area. And thus the people that you're most proximately close to would have a provision of a better life, which includes both agency and resources. And even if you're removed from them, their sense of pride and value you is still elevated by them engaging in social mobility. The challenge then opening opposition secondly levels is it's the proximity that you have towards them that is an aspect of pride, as in the reason they want you and like you and have pride towards you is because they're seeing you every day, etc. Here's where I think the external validation of this clash becomes important. So the second question of the clash of how people view you is how the external people, like the Mali people now view you. Opening government's conception is when now you enter into this new community, your family takes on a valorized and patriotic state, and thus the oppression they've experienced towards them now disappears and dissipates because now they're being accepted as a patriotic value. What this does then is it describes the inverse of what opening opposition's weighing was, which is if it's the proximity and the conception of repression that means individuals opt into community rather than societal narratives, this presumably now isn't the case if they've now moved into an area that accepts them, which means opening government's power of the monopoly narratives that we discussed get even a larger margin closer to totality. This is just to say that now we think once your family moves, which we're convinced they are able to do so and can do so, their conception of you will change in a positive way, as in now they would just be prideful of you because you're being a warrior champion, warrior candidate, whatever. And thus they aren't precluded from the pride. This is just to say opening opposition probably are still true that your wider community will now no longer maybe be resentful of you and they won't accept you. But if now the argument is it's the proximity towards people that affects how you care about what they think of you, if now you're only caring about the people that, if the closest people to you are now more supportive of you because you've distanced yourself from the people who aren't valuable to you, aren't supportive of you, opening government still acts as the idea of you giving back to your family as in a reparatory obligation, but also the value you feel of yourself of pride because those people around you now benefit. This is a very potentially over-verbose, but quite, I hope, implicit and nuanced way of describing whether top-up clash works the way it does. As in the rebuttal of opening opposition is good, but not sufficient in delinking how the most proximate individuals around you are still able to enforce a better system of pride when you have moved and provided them a better life, both because of internal and external conception. That is how we see the top half main clash, which is how the community's internal and external react to you, and why we are convinced marginally that opening government are correct, that your community is better able to it does valorize, the proximate community valorizes you better when you're able to provide them high resources and indeed valorize some conceptions of yourself, albeit that we think that's a less important clash in top half, as in what happens to you is not as important as what happens to other people around you, because what happens to other people around you more greatly affects you than your own system of pride. So that is how we see top half. Moving into the other comparisons in the rounding, so what does closing government provide? So we have largely three things that come from closing government. The first is a type of weighing extension where they try to justify why the value of the community matters, and namely trying to make the margins larger to explain why it's only the Malarian community that can provide the resources opening government provides. We think this weighing / framing extension is definitely novel. We don't think it elevates the margin of opening government here. So just considering the gov bench persuasiveness, we don't think it elevates the margin of opening government because we still think it's dependent upon opening government's reasons why the state is incentivized to give you the resources in the first place. So it's all well and good saying there's a disparity of resources and only this nation can provide, these people can provide them to you. I think opening government has done sufficient intuitions to justify why this is true, as in the DPM justifies why the reason there is a disparity of resources is because they're wanting to suppress you and oppress you, and they do so because they want to enfranchise their own wealth and resources such that you can't fight back against them. I think this is a sufficient intuition to why the Malarian people can provide resources. And indeed, secondarily, I don't think closing government justifies relative to opening opposition why there aren't other types of resources that would be beneficial to be provided, namely the community support that opening opposition argues. So whilst this is a definitely novel frame, we don't think this is like, we can't see the clear strategic implications to why it's persuasive, either responsively or by margins of opening government. So we don't think this is going to be, we don't think this beats opening government or opening opposition. On the framing extension, which is somewhat an member government and a government whip about what people care most about is aspects of things like social control or social buy-in. So there's some stuff that comes in government whip more so than member of government, but we resolve that we think this is sufficiently responsive that it's not too novel to be discredited. This is largely the response you give to opening opposition about family stress, as in remaining in the community is better because you once again try to challenge opening opposition in the same realm that opening government does about the power that the community has over you. I want to first start with how this response levies against opening opposition, because it'll be clear when I explain why the response wasn't sufficient to show why opening government's current line of responsiveness was sufficient, and thus why that response is not weighing you above opening government. As in, you couldn't beat a team by having a weaker response, basically. So a lot of the member of government weighing is to bite into opening opposition's justification of the world. As in, opening opposition levies that what happens to your social community, your social values, is not just more important, but more likely to be true because the limited power of the state. At the point at which, therefore, member of government is conceding this ground, it concedes the framed opening opposition's proximity stuff in a large volume of totality. So when government whip tries to respond by saying that actually what the community values itself, as in you wanting to remain in the community, they don't want to remain in the community because of the idea of viscerality of the emotion. There's a lot of stuff in opening opposition that would persuade us to the opposite, as in how those people view their value, how they think of the obligations of them towards you and you towards them, the idea that they just want your physical proximity, they don't care about your resource provision in the first place. And indeed, if you're conceding the ground that the community doesn't really care that much about what the Malarian people tell them or what the Malarian people provide to them, it's unclear why the type of response you're levying about the family stress or community matters. The second response you do try to levy, though, is to claim that that community is by its nature fragmented, and thus you don't actually have this consolidation of the community that open opposition wants. There is disagreements about the strength of this response. I think this is maybe true, but I don't actually know why it is true. Opening opposition levies the justification to why the community is likely to be consolidated, because it's the only type of resource it's the only way you could actually access resources is by collective mobilization. Indeed, if member of government's framing is correct that only Malusian people could provide this resource, this justifies that opening opposition are probably more true then, which is if these people still survive and can only survive through collective action because they can't have resources otherwise, this may be described why actually there aren't as fragmented as member of government, government whip talks about. As in, we are convinced that opening opposition is at least sufficiently true, if not totality true, that at least a lot of people are socially cohesive together, value each other. The intuition from closing government is that it's because resources that are tight, you have to intercompete with each other, and that creates a resentment. Potentially, but why does that override the community bonds of being around each other all the time, seeing each other in a shared struggle and providing for each other when you can? These are therefore two contesting frames that I think necessitates either weighing to describe why yours are more likely than opening oppositions, or why even as a minority that cares more. We should care more about the minority instances. Because at the point at which we're convinced that opening opposition is true more instances than not, we must be convinced that the actor is likely to experience the emotions from the community more likely than not as opening opposition does. Not only margin of analysis, opening opposition are more true about how your community affects you. At that point, then, you can see that the response was not sufficient against opening opposition, is meaningfully weaker, because the margin of the claim to be true is much weaker than opening government's retort, which is that there is power in the monopolistic narratives that a state has when they extract you from that region. And thus, they're actually biting into opening opposition's weighing about how narratives activate by proximity. And that's why we think it's a better response, because we think it defeats opening opposition on its own grounds, rather than the closing government response, which is the competing framing that has significantly less clear margins. That's how we see CG's interaction with Topper. Namely, they don't extend the margin of opening government on provision of their family resources or describe more clearly, sufficiently clearly why there's a larger disparity whilst also having their own independent reasons to why the community is better held by being a part of this new majoritarian, nor do they respond to opening opposition effectively to why the community will not abandon you or make you feel significantly worse on the significant large number of instances that could be true in opening opposition as well. Last but not least, then closing opposition. For the closing opposition add to the round, I'm first going to do this on op bench. So opening opposition has justified why the communal clash of the round, as in how the community views you, is important. Therefore, I think this deprioritizes some of the argumentation of closing opposition about self-value, as in how you view yourself, whether or not you think of yourself as an instrumentalized actor. This does not preclude closing opposition at all, because a lot of their arguments are also tiered onto the social angle, as in how other people will view you as you being a titan. It is something that is fundamentally alien and wrong and something you can't relate to and something your family has fear towards, and the state of dehumanization is bad for you, is all fine. So this therefore is just a question of analytical certainty. So it's opening opposition to claim that the reason the community does not like you is because you're not upholding the values they want you to do and that you're physically distant. It is more of a persuasive reason to why they would likely not like you than the conception of you being a titan and having the psychological harms that go with this. I think both of these are sufficiently plausible on the face of it and sufficient and as true as each other on the face of it. However, if we step in and think about the steps of analysis here, opening opposition has done more work to justify why a lot of individuals are likely to have their conception of the world, as opposed to closing opposition's conception of inhumanity. As in, yes, the Titan might be conceived inhumanly because this person has lost control, but why is this a better reason to describe why they are less likely to support you than you giving up on an obligation and giving in to the enemy, for instance? The giving into the enemy argumentation seems more intuitive because it activates sooner than you turning into a Titan. It is probably more visceral to these individuals because it's more obvious that you've left the community, then become a Titan, etc. So these are the two reasons why we think at the face value of the analysis, because there's never explicitly weighed for us, we think opening opposition's justification for why the community would abandon you and not like you is more true than closing opposition's first extension. Their second extension, though, is the nature of that family when they move. So they say that if open government are correct, that you move into this new region, you are going to be physically separated from this person, and the family that comes with you will not have access to agency, and basically you'll be a slave to their whims in the sense that they won't have any free agency, and therefore the comparative is better because even if you're in states of desperation and deprivation, you still have aspects of free agency and you can struggle together. How first does this analysis interact with opening opposition on the clash of what happens better or not to your family? Opening opposition has similar lines of analysis, or similar claims, should I say, to why the agency and value of self matters. This comes in Leader of Opposition about the feeling of power of safety, and at the very end of Leader of Opposition about a degree to which you can have acute presentation of your harms and why you need therefore to be existing in order to satisfy this obligation. Thus, the question, again, is the same as the first part of the analysis, which is, do we think closing opposition are showing us that this is more likely to be true for people, as in more people are likely to believe that they are dehumanized? Or is it just more true that the state actually doesn't, the conception of the state is true in closing opposition's world? Opening opposition, we think, has the more compelling justification about which narratives people are likely to buy into more, which is the weighing in DLO to describe why the proximity of that narrative is a cash arbitrator about what people are more likely to believe than not. So whilst we think on the level of intuition, closing opposition's rhetoric was definitely persuasive in some levels, as in we do think the aspect of slavery would be very bad for these people and would be a reason why they would disconnect from you and thus trying to flip the social valuation arguments on top off. We don't know, however, we don't think the certainty of this claim is as high as an open opposition, or at least meaningfully as high as an open opposition. So why will the state crack down on you if opening government has argued that the state's incentive is not to do so because they want you not to be stressed, and opening opposition by absence of responses conceded to this argumentation? Or why is it the case that your agency is sufficiently free if you're deprived of resources and coerced by the state because you don't have the opening opposition response about why opening government aren't true about the way in which the totalitarian state would affect you? This is not to say I'm using top half to justify off bench. I'm just making it sure that trying to make it clearer to whether the analytical stuff in closing opposition seems less strong than opening opposition based on the context of the round, and then you're engaging less with the round through the analysis, which is the third reason why we find it weaker. That's how we see op bench then, which is they are similar levied claims on social argumentation, but nevertheless opening opposition seems on face of it more persuasive than closing opposition. This is one of the rare instances where we would probably need to be explained to us why the analysis is meaningfully stronger, either on why it affects why more people are likely to believe why CO's analysis more likely demonstrates why people believe what they're talking about as opposed to opening opposition, considering you're running similar angles. The stuff about how you view yourself and value yourself is deprioritized for the weighing stuff I talk about in opening opposition themselves. And there's no counter weighing to why you should value your community in and of itself. This indeed is justified on back off quite convincingly to why actually there must be social cohesion or else the self-prioritization narrative would matter. Opening opposition claims there is social cohesion, which means by that weighing against back off, we are going to deprioritize the self-valuation clash. Cool. The final comparison then CO versus the Gov bench. On the long diagonal then, so the conception that the way closing opposition could beat opening government is by disproving the claim that your family is meaningfully benefited in a way that means they give you social affection by being into the community of the majoritarian. The claim from closing opposition is either they would disengage with you because your biology is fundamentally different, or because they would be sufficiently dehumanized and thus would not like that experience. Open government has contentions that are not yet engaged with, and indeed there is a lack of POI engagement from opposition whip, for instance, which means there is a greater emphasis we place upon closing opposition to have this response present. Namely, why the external actors are likely to valorize you, as in the majoritarians are likely to valorize you as being a part of their now protective community, and why actually there is not this selfish state incentive to provide some agency for your family. The extent of closing opposition's analysis is they will only give you stuff as long as you do what they want you to do. But closing open government says you will do what they want you to do, and thus you get the provision of that resources. Because their open government's reasoning is that's why you're doing it. One of the reasons why you're doing it in the first place. So whilst there may be some constraints, maybe even more constrained versus closing opposition, we don't think it's still sufficient to disprove opening government that those individuals are going to, your immediate family are going to so devalorize you either internally or externally. On the back half then, I think this is effectively resolved by government whip to explain why actually, if it is the case that closing government is correct, the social discohesion is so true, then the self-prioritization of how you value yourself as a human character becomes more important for clash determinant and back half than it did in top half. We think closing opposition are convincingly, usually because of an absence of response when closing government, why you don't like the fact that you're turning into a titan, etc. The government whip's response is, well, you just either don't know about this because it's the first instance, or you don't care about this. I think this is the delinking from what the point of an actor's motion is. We think closing opposition's reasoning is sufficient to persuade an actor that they should likely feel fear that this is true because they'll lose capacity of their control of themselves, and the social narratives, etc., will make you feel as if you're a different person. This seems to an actor sufficient to justify why they, if they are self-interested, would not want to do this. Obviously, this analysis only works on back half because of the social discohesion framing of closing government. Namely, every by closing government's responses to top half about there's not social cohesion in the internal group, then that would prioritize the selfish clash of closing opposition, which they are convincingly winning. If closing opposition had weighed the selfish clash above the communal clash in the round, the call probably would have been dramatically different, because that would have been a better defense against open government and open opposition. And I think the analysis of self-value from open government is not socially defined. And thus this would have been a clearer way by weighing closing opposition to win. They didn't on top half, but they did on back half, which is why we see CO beating CG. These are all the comparisons in the round and as much detail as I tried to give. If you would like any feedback or questions, I can stick on around on the call. But good luck for future rounds.